Before the formation of a Jewish state, a man with the help of his God rained plagues upon the house of Pharaoh until he relinquished his Jewish captives. Then, with his people in tow, he left Egypt with livestock and possessions and headed east in the direction of the Promised Land. If this story sounds familiar, it should. It was the basis for the 1956 Cecil B. DeMille picture, The Ten Commandments, starring Charlton Heston, and the 1998 animated movie, The Prince of Egypt, with Val Kilmer, Michelle Pfeiffer, Patrick Stewart, and many other A-list actors. It's the story of Moses told in the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. But in this introduction, I wasn't referring to the story of Moses or the book of Exodus. I was talking about Abraham in the book of Genesis, and the time he sold his wife to the pharaoh to serve as a prostitute in his harem. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. The earliest mention of Israel is from the Merneptah stele, though it seems to be referencing a tribe of people, not an organized nation. But if we take that as a starting point for the history of the people and examine their history over the last 3,000 years, and look at all of the times they existed as a sovereign nation, then we'll notice an unsettling detail. For roughly 86% of Israel's history, it has been ruled and occupied by foreign powers. This is the opposite of what we should expect from a nation that is descended from a single man who was chosen by the Creator of the universe to form a great nation that would exist in perpetuity. So the covenant of Abraham doesn't seem to have panned out. But that's because the story of Abraham isn't about the past or the future of a nation, but the hope of a people. Abraham serves as the progenitor of not only the Jewish people and the nation of Israel, but also three of the largest religious groups in the world, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which, when combined, make up roughly 55% of the world's population. His story begins in chapter 12 of Genesis, but he's first mentioned in chapter 11, verse 26, when the descendants of Shem are listed to connect Noah with Abraham. Though he's called Abram in these early chapters of the book, his name will be changed to Abraham in chapter 17. The early reference to Abram in chapter 11 causes a problem, notably an anachronism in verse 28. Terah is listed as the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begat Lot, which is where this character enters the story. We'll get back to Lot later. Then we find something interesting when we're told that, while the family was still in the city of Ur of the Chaldeans, Haran died. We're also told that this is the native land of Terah and his family. So why is this important? Because we know the history of the city of Ur, including the time period in which the Chaldeans ruled the city. So, by stating that Abram and his father lived in the city of Ur during the time in which the Chaldeans ruled the city, not only gives us a location for his origin story, but a time frame as well. And that's the problem. The Chaldeans came to rule over the city of Ur in the middle of the 7th century BCE, just a generation or so before Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. This places the timing for Abraham roughly 1,300 years after the biblical literalists would have you believe. But this is hardly the only anachronism found in the Abraham stories. Genesis 24 will mention a servant riding a camel, but domesticated camels didn't exist in this region until about 950 years before the Common Era, about 900 or so years after the time Abraham supposedly lived. Then there's the issue of the Philistines mentioned in Genesis 21, which arrived on the scene around 1200 BCE, a full 6 centuries after the time of Abraham. Why are these details mentioned if they weren't in existence during the time of Abraham? The answer is simple. The authors of these stories never meant for them to take place 3,800 years ago. They were writing about something they imagined to have occurred in the not-so-distant past, and since they were writing after the Babylonians destroyed Judah, They were writing about a world that wasn't too different from the one in which they lived at the time, one where worshippers of Yahweh were traveling from Babylon to Judah to make a home for themselves and forge a national identity that would strengthen the bonds of the community and prevent further influence from external sources. It was only when these stories were linked with others to form a longer narrative in which Adam led to Noah, Noah to Abraham, Abraham to Moses, and Moses to the current period, that things began to get complicated. These were originally parallel stories, not stories meant to be read together. By stitching them together into a single narrative, it screwed up the timeline, which was never meant to be accurate anyway. We have a plethora of text from Israelite sources prior to the return of the exiles, and something curious is lacking. None of the people are named Abram or Abraham. When a literary figure becomes popular, their name begins to appear in public records as people begin naming their children after the character. This was true in the ancient world, and it's still true today. Just look at all the girls named Khaleesi after Game of Thrones became popular. But in pre-exilic records and literature, the name of Abram and Abraham are conspicuously absent. This wasn't a Jewish name prior to the return from Babylon. It simply didn't exist in their culture. The same is true of Isaac, Jacob, and Moses. This isn't to say that the name Abraham didn't exist in the ancient world. It did, just not in Israel. It was quite popular in the ancient world, but it was a Babylonian name. Also, before we move on, we need to discuss the birth of Abraham. According to one midrash, Nimrod was a great ruler and hosted a grand banquet on the same night that Abram was born. His astrologers looked into the sky during the party and saw a comet crossing the sky, devouring stars along its path. They understood this as a sign that a newborn baby would become a mighty emperor and his sons would depose kings. So Nimrod sought to kill Terah's son, offering to buy the infant from his father. Terah agreed, asking no price for his son, but instead asked a favor, that he have 3 days with his child and kinsman before handing over his infant son. After 3 days, Terah gave Nimrod the infant of a slave girl instead, so that the king murdered that child, and the infant Abram's life was spared. Abram was then hidden in a cave with a foster mother for the next 10 years. Being unable to see the sun, moon, sacred groves, or idols that people had made, he emerged without knowledge of these things, and thus couldn't see them as holy. So he only worshipped Yahweh. This version was inspired by the mythical nativity story of Cyrus as told by Herodotus. In another version of the story, Nimrod himself was knowledgeable of astrology and learned from the stars that soon a child would be born, who would overthrow the gods that he worshipped. So he began slaughtering 70,000 infant boys in the land, prompting the angels to reproach God for allowing such a slaughter to occur. Terah and his pregnant wife Amittai hid in a cave on the Euphrates River to give birth. When Abram was born, his face was glowing so brightly that it illuminated the entire length of the cave. That same night, Amittai abandoned her son, who was then cared for by the angel Gabriel, who suckled him with milk from his little finger of his right hand. 10 nights later, he was grown and walking, and Abram went down to the Euphrates where he looked up at the stars and thought he should worship them. But when they vanished at dawn, he decided that gods do not vanish. He then came to the conclusion that there must be an unseen God that is above the sun, moon, and stars, a greater sky god whom he would worship. Anyway, let's get back to Genesis. We're told that Abram took a wife named Sarai, whose name will later be changed to Sarah in Genesis chapter 17. But she's barren, and as we'll later learn, she is also Abram's half-sister. They settled in the land of Haran. Terah died at the age of 205, at which time Abram departed for the land of Canaan. Terah's age is a bit of a problem, as the Noah story says that the lifespan of humans was limited to 120 years, but he lives nearly double that. But he isn't even the oldest person in this chapter. Serug was 230 when he died. Rio was 239, Eber was 464, and Shem was 600 years old. In fact, many of the ancestors of Abram, including survivors of the flood, would have still been running about when Abram was alive, yet all of them are said to have died prior to Abram being announced. Also, some versions of the story of Abraham have him making an offering of a slaughtered lamb before 12 idols. He then sits to watch the idols to see if they actually eat the offering. When they don't, he mocks the idols and hacks them to pieces with an axe. We'll encounter a similar story in the book of Daniel involving an idol of Bel Marduk. Anyway, Abram's father inquires about the destruction of his gods, to which Abram replies that they must have fought over the food offering. Terah responds by telling young Abram that they're idols fashioned by the hands of man, a phrase common in post-exilic writings concerning the use of idols. Abram then points out that idols fashioned by people can't answer prayer or eat food. In response to this, Terah denounced Abram and handed him over to Nimrod, who had the patriarch tossed into a lit furnace, again like the story of Daniel. And like the story of Daniel, the flames rose up and consumed the men who cast Abram into the fire, but Abram himself was unharmed. Again, back to Genesis, for real this time. Any national leader or prophet has their story begin with a call to action scene, which we find in chapter 12 for Abram. Yahweh speaks to him directly and tells him to exit the land of his father and go to a land that the God will show him, and if he does that, then Yahweh will make of him a great nation and bless his name, so that all of the people of earth will find a blessing in his name. Also, Abram is said to be father of a multitude, which in the story is meant to be understood as father of the nation of Israel, but that doesn't quite make sense, as Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes, not Abram. Abram originally was a moon god, and his son Isaac was a sun god. We'll get deeper into this later in episode 10. But one common part of moon deity lore is that they're the parent of the many stars. This little detail of Abram's mythology has been preserved and retooled to serve as a link between him and the people of Israel. Before moving on from this, we must talk about patterns. The main section of the patriarchal stories can be split into 3 sections, that of Abraham, that of Jacob, and that of Joseph. Each section begins with the same phrase, "These are the descendants of," though some Bibles translate it differently, and each section ends with the death and burial of a major figure. Each section is then separated by a genealogy. But each of these 3 stories are constructed around the following themes. The hero leaves home, the hero quarrels with his brothers or cousins, the hero goes down to Egypt, the hero's wife is barren, the hero's wife quarrels with another woman, and finally a younger son is favored. Keep this in mind as we continue our study of the book of Genesis. So he departed the land with his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot, along with all the wealth and slaves that they had collected from the land of Haran, and set out for Canaan, and arrived at Shechem by the oak of Moreh. Shechem was a central site of worship for the northern kingdom of Israel. Moreh, or Mount Moreh, was a sacred place for the Canaanites and later Israelites, and contained a terebinth grove where oracles would commune with their deities, including Yahweh. This is thought to be the mountain where Abraham would later attempt to sacrifice his son. According to verse 7, he builds an altar there. This serves as an etiological tale for the sacred site. Stories like this were meant to serve as a legitimate origin story for the holy place, so the people could pretend that ancient Canaanite places of worship were anything but. They were, according to other verses, shrines to Baal. Later, despite the Yahwistic pedigree granted by such stories as Genesis, these hilltop shrines and altars would be destroyed and desecrated. In the story, Abram then moves closer to Bethel and Ai and builds another altar to Yahweh. Then we're told in verse 8 that he invoked Yahweh by his name. This contradicts Exodus, in which Yahweh tells Moses that the patriarchs never knew Yahweh by that name. The reason for this is because the two gods were being merged, Elyon and Yahweh, and the authors of these stories were editing the tales to pretend that they were one God. So when they encountered stories like those of the patriarchs, which often were centered around the god Elyon, they needed to insert the name of Yahweh. Exodus, which was always a story about Yahweh and not El, had to do the opposite. So when Yahweh introduced himself to Moses, he said that his name was the same as Elyon, the God of Abraham, but that Abraham used the name El and not Yahweh. Little did that redactor know that another editor would make the same alteration to the book of Genesis, found here in chapter 12, that would insert the name of Yahweh into the Abraham story, thus creating the contradiction with the book of Exodus. Beginning in verse 10, we have the first of three nearly identical stories concerning one of the patriarchs selling his wife into the harem of a foreign ruler. The compilers of Genesis collected three variants of the same tale and chose to include all three, separating them with other material to prevent the readers from noticing the duplication. What's interesting about this story is that it wasn't originally part of the narrative. If you read Genesis 12, verses 1 through 9, and then skip to chapter 13, you realize that it's a direct continuation. Verse 9 states that Abram journeyed by stages to Negeb from Bethel and Ai. Then the story continues in chapter 13 in Negeb with his family. So chapter 12, verses 10 to 20, and the opening words of chapter 13, where it says, "from Egypt," were inserted later. The Egypt story is inserted in part to explain Abram's wealth, which is mentioned in chapter 13, verse 2. In this story, Abram and Sarai travel to Egypt to escape severe famine in Canaan. So much for it being a fertile promised land. There was just one problem. The elderly Sarai, who was about 65 at the time, was so beautiful that Abram realized that he might be murdered by an Egyptian who would wish to steal her for himself. So what does the upright father of monotheism do? He comes up with a clever deception. Since Sarai is both his wife and his half-sister, he will omit the wife part of their relationship and only tell people that this is his sister. This makes her available to other men and keeps Abram safe. So upon their arrival in Egypt, she was sent to the pharaoh's harem in exchange for sheep, oxen, donkeys, camels, and slaves. Not bad, considering the price for purchasing a bride in the Hebrew Bible was typically 30 shekels of silver, or just a couple of animals, not the vast riches that Sarai fetched. But Yahweh had plans for Sarai, and her giving birth to a bunch of Egyptian babies wasn't part of the deal. So he afflicted Pharaoh's household as punishment for sleeping with the patriarch's wife. Pharaoh expressed outrage at Abram's deception and commands both of them to leave the country. This pattern of males being endangered in a foreign land, the females being spared, Yahweh visiting curses upon the king, and the patriarch leaving the land with vast wealth and slaves, will be repeated in episode 10, with Abram running the exact same scam on King Abimelech, and with Isaac in episode 11, running the same scheme on the same King Abimelech, as well as the book of Exodus, when we get a longer version of the story with Moses and the Pharaoh. Also, this is where Abram picked up the slave girl Hagar, whom he will later rape to father his first son, Ishmael. We get back to the original narrative as the story picks up in chapter 13 with Abram and his family back in Negeb, where they were before the inserted story about Egypt. The patriarch continues traveling by stages from Negeb to Bethel, stopping along the way to visit the first altar and again invoke Yahweh by his name, which again wasn't supposed to happen until the book of Exodus. But Abram and Lot couldn't live together because their flocks were too large, so they had to go their separate ways to prevent further quarreling. They saw how lush the land was, like Yahweh's own garden, a reference to the original purpose of the Garden of Eden. So Abram and Lot separated from one another, with Abram settling in Canaan and Lot settling in the plains. This meant to serve as an ideological tale for the Israelites, Moabites, and Ammonites. They're all related Semitic groups, but the Judahite writers wish to remind the readers that they have a dim view of their neighbors, the Moabites and Ammonites. This will reappear later when we cover the story of Lot in the next episode. But they make sure to mention here that the inhabitants of Sodom were wicked sinners against Yahweh. There's no mention of the nature of that sin, but we find references later that mention the sin was mistreating the poor, such as Ezekiel 16:49. Yahweh then tells Abram to look to the north, south, east, and west, and all that he can see will be given to his descendants to inhabit forever. But as we'll soon learn, forever isn't very long. In celebration of this news, Abram went to the terebinth tree of Mamre, another pagan sacred site, and built an altar there as well, giving us another Yahwistic pedigree for another shrine to Baal that was later used by the Jews. Chapter 14 gives us the tale of the four kings. The kings of Shinar, Elasar, Elam, and Goim joined together and made war against several Israelite cities and their neighbors, which lasted over a decade. During one of these battles, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fell into some sort of tar pits in the Siddim Valley, causing their armies to scatter to the mountains. During this defeat, the four kings seized the supplies of the ruined armies, as well as Lot, who had been living in Sodom at the time. A resident of the city witnessed this and sought out Abram to inform him of his nephew's fate. Of course, if we were reading this as a historical account, we'd be asking how a distant witness recognized a single man among the many who were captured, then knew who that man was related to, and then knew where to find that particular migratory relative who roamed between Babylon, Canaan, and Egypt on a regular basis. But we aren't supposed to understand this as history. This is folklore. The camera is focused on the named characters, so when the anonymous survivor sees a known character, he instantly recognizes the man and knows where to find someone who can advance the story. This nameless witness finds Abram camping at the sacred grove of Mamre. This contradicts later stories which attempt to separate Abram from such practices which were eventually considered taboo. But we find numerous references to his links with sacred groves, profane altars, and idols in the patriarchal stories, such as Joshua 24:2, in which we learn that Abraham worshipped idols along with his father. When Abram heard that his nephew had been captured, he mustered 318 of his armed retainers and marched on the army of the four kings. Somehow, their minuscule force is able to defeat a military coalition that's been conquering cities for over a decade and pursue them beyond Damascus. He pilfered from them many possessions, liberated his nephew Lot, and took many of the women from the army. These women would have been the women that were taken as the spoils of war by the invaders. They would have been used as sex slaves, and their children would have become the next generation of soldiers. The Israelites will behave in the same manner, as we'll see in later episodes. At the end of the chapter, we find a story of some strangeness. As Abram is returning from his battle, he's greeted by the king of Sodom, who came out from the city to meet him in the valley of Sheveh, meaning the valley of kings. We're then told that Melchizedek, king of Salem and high priest of Elyon, brought out bread and wine to bless Abram by his God, the creator of heaven and earth. Abram then paid tribute to Melchizedek by giving him a tenth of everything he took from the invaders, but the high priest asked for only the captives, not the goods. But Abram replied to the king of Sodom that he had sworn to Yahweh, the God Most High, that he wouldn't take anything that belonged to the high priest. So he gave over everything except for what his servants had needed and the payment that he gave to his armed men. Now let's examine this story. First, it says that the king of Sodom came out to greet them, but the king of Sodom had died a few verses earlier when he fell into the tar pit. Also, it places the story in the valley of Sheveh, not the valley of Siddim, the valley where Sodom is located. This king is then identified as Melchizedek, king of Salem, not Sodom, the high priest of Elyon. Later stories will attempt to link Salem with Jerusalem, which sounds plausible as Salem could be a shortened form of the word. But there's a problem with that. The city of Jerusalem itself. You see, it wasn't called Salem and then later had the prefix Jeru added to it. It was called Jebus and had the suffix Salem appended to the end. So how do we get a conflation of Salem and Sodom in this story? Here's what seems to have happened. The story is about Abram's blessing by Melchizedek, the king and high priest of Salem, a northern kingdom city. But the compilers of Genesis were focused on the southern kingdom and their identity, and didn't want Abram linked with a site of worship outside of Jerusalem. So someone attempted to change the text to link Melchizedek with Sodom, a name which is similar to Salem, and one which is mentioned earlier in the story. Other attempts would be made to obscure his link with the northern kingdom, such as imagining that Salem and Jerusalem were the same city. In the New Testament, specifically in Hebrews chapter 7, the priesthood of Melchizedek will be imagined to be a forerunner to Christianity. These contradictory redactions point to a conflict between the Melchizedek priesthood and that of the Zadokites, who were reforming Judaism. Unfortunately, as much of their folklore and tradition has been destroyed and rewritten, we may never truly understand the nature and importance of this priest-king. But some stories seem to imagine that he's an earthly incarnation of Elyon or Yahweh, and that his name is actually a title for the divine kingship. He's the archetypal ruler that the likes of David should strive to mimic and ultimately fall short. Or perhaps he's an archangel. Other stories have him as a sort of reincarnated Enoch. There are even hints that Enoch, Melchizedek, Elijah, and Jesus are all the same person, arriving on the scene whenever the people of Israel need them most. Whatever the case may be, this story serves as yet another version of the call of the prophet scene in which Abram is chosen by divine authority and blessed in order to carry on his holy mission. Abram has several such stories, including the first in which he destroys the idols of his father and departs Babylon to journey into Canaan, and the scene on the mountain where he nearly kills his son Isaac. This can be seen with the verse which immediately follows the story of Melchizedek, where the word of Yahweh comes to Abram, and he offers to protect the patriarch and make him a great nation. We see this in modern Bibles as a separate story, only because of the chapter divisions, which separates chapter 14 and 15, but those divisions weren't in the original text. The covenant with Yahweh immediately followed the conversation with Melchizedek, up until the 13th century, when the chapter divisions were then added. After Yahweh makes the promise to Abram to reward him, Abram replies that he can receive no such reward because he didn't have any children. What's interesting here is that he calls the deity by the name of Yahweh, though according to Exodus 6:3, the patriarchs didn't know the name of Yahweh, a clear contradiction to Genesis 15:2. Abram laments the fact that he has no offspring and thus no heirs for his property, which is literary foreshadowing. The author is setting up for a miracle by presenting an unsolvable problem. Yahweh instructs Abram to look up at the sky and count the stars. They are as numerous as his future descendants. This isn't just a promise of a grand future for the patriarch, but a hint as to his mythological past. As the Jews ventured closer to monotheism, they had to discard most of their old gods. Some were merged with other deities, as Elyon, Baal, and Yahweh were merged. Others were demonized, like Dagon and Marduk. Finally, some were demythologized and reimagined as folk heroes, like Samson the sun god and Abram the moon god. This tidbit we have here about the stars of the sky being the offspring of Abram is a relic of his ancient role as a moon god and progenitor of the lesser lights of the night sky. And before you ask, yes, Isaac was a sun god to rival Abraham. In another version of the story, God carries Abram up above the earth and beyond the firmament so he can see all the stars and attempt to count them. Yahweh then reiterates his covenant with Abram by stating that he has brought him from the city of Ur of the Chaldeans to give the land of Canaan to him as his possession, which also reestablishes the timeline and sets our tale firmly in the Babylonian or post-Babylonian period, when the Chaldeans ruled Ur, and Semitic migrants were traveling west into Canaan. Now that the covenant has been made, or remade, the deal must be sealed. And in the ancient world, the most important covenants were sealed in blood, and the Jews were no exception. The completion of the covenant requires Abram to collect a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, along with a dove and a young pigeon. These animals were slaughtered, and the mammals were split in half and spread out. Upon sunset, Abram fell asleep and was filled with dread as Yahweh began speaking to him. He told him of the centuries of slavery in a foreign land, a reference to the material that was added to the early chapters of the Exodus story, meaning this part of the chapter was added to Genesis sometime after Exodus reached its current form. Before moving on, we must explain the slain animals. Abram sacrifices 5 animals, a heifer, a she-goat, and a ram, which are all divided in half. Then he slays a pair of birds, a turtle dove and a pigeon, one tossed to either side among the halves of the mammals. But what's the symbolism here? The 3 herd animals represent the 3 empires which conquered the land of Judah, that of Babylon, Persia, and Greece. This is why they are slain with a sword instead of a knife, the typical means of slaughter for animal sacrifices. They are meant to fall through military conquest. The birds represent the 2 lines of Abraham's descendants, the Israelites and Judahites. But this gives us a bit of a problem here. The reference to the 3 consecutive conquering empires. We already know these stories are compiled in the post-Babylonian period, as they specifically mention Ur of the Chaldees as Abraham's point of origin. And the Persians were the people who ended Babylon's reign in the region when Cyrus conquered them and released the Jewish captives to make that return journey to Judah. But it would be another 2 centuries before Alexander the Great defeated Persia. This pushes the date of some of the Genesis material forward into the Hellenistic period, meaning the Torah was still being written and compiled at least as late as the 4th century BCE, though this passage actually points to an even later dating, as it assumes the Greek rule of Alexander, often represented by the ram due to his association with the god Amun-Ra, has already ended. A flame suddenly appeared between the dismembered animal carcasses, a symbol of Yahweh's presence according to Exodus and Ezekiel. Yahweh repeated his promise to Abram and outlined a great plot of land that extended from Egypt to the Euphrates. Of course, the Judahites never ruled over such a vast expanse of territory. This was wishful thinking, that they would one day rule over an empire similar to that of the Babylonians or Persians. And that's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.